In a recent video, we looked at altered predominance in the form of mode mixture. We continue our study of altered predominance by looking at the Neapolitan chord. The Neapolitan chord is an example of an altered predominant. In other words, a predominant chord, like 4 or 2, that has one pitch chromatically altered by one half step. In the example below from Mozart's Miserere Mei, we see the soprano voice move upward a half step to B flat, chromatically inflecting the 4 chord. Here we are in A minor, and we have this sound. We move from a 4-6 to a 4, and then we have that B flat in the uppermost voice, acting almost like a neighbor tone, in fact, acting just like a neighbor tone in the soprano voice, and then moving down to our dominant chord. This moment is a prime example of the formation of a Neapolitan chord. The chromatic alteration of that 4 chord creates a chord that looks like a flat major 2, or a major chord built on the lowered second scale degree. So we have B flat, which would essentially be quote-unquote the root of the chord, and then F and D. So it's a major triad. It looks like it's built on the flatted second scale degree, and it looks like it could be analyzed as a flat major 2. However, it's important to note that this chord is appearing in first inversion. This is the defining position of the Neapolitan harmony. It's almost always occurring as in first inversion, and in fact, most theorists, if they see a chord that looks like a Neapolitan that's not in first inversion, they talk about it as a different sort of harmony. Lastly, we see that it's functioning in a predominant context. It's functioning in the midst of all these 4 chords and then moves on to a 5. So it's a highlight in this moment before moving on to that 5-4-2 chord. So looks like a flat major 2, appears in first inversion, and is in a predominant context. Those are sort of the 3 highlights of the Neapolitan chord. In some typical uses in progressions, we could see it as 4, Neapolitan 6, 4, just like we saw in the previous example, as an ornamentation of the 4 chord. Equally possible is moving directly from N6 to 5, like that. Or you can have a chord coming between it and the 5 chord. We could have that 4 chord like we saw before. But also common is moving to 1-6-4, to a cadential 6-4. Now, you'll notice that I've been using mostly minor mode Roman numerals in this analysis. This is because Neapolitans occur less frequently in the major mode, though they do sometimes occur. It tends to be a little bit more common as we move towards the Romantic era, but they do occur in the major mode in as early as the Baroque. This is because in the major mode, 2 pitches have to be altered to make a major chord based on the lowered second scale degree. We'd have to lower scale degree 2 and scale degree 6. But it does happen, and it can sound quite cool. Here's A major, and here's what it might sound like if we had an N6 in the midst of that. It's quite dramatic, so it's not necessarily for everyday use, but for something special. In rare cases, Neapolitans can be used in plagal progressions, moving from Neapolitan 6 directly to the tonic. Remember that Neapolitans are functioning as predominants, so this actually makes sense because it works in a plagal context. And note that the Neapolitan is 99% of the time going to occur in first inversion. And there's great arguments back and forth as to whether a root position Neapolitan even exists. We won't get into that right now, and suffice it to say, if you use Neapolitans in your progressions, try to use them in first inversion always. Let's talk about some idiomatic part writing. So, in terms of doubling, in this case, the root of the Neapolitan, quote unquote, in other words, the lowered second scale degree, is almost never doubled. Remember that altered tones are rarely doubled because they tend to be tendency tones. So if you have two of them, they're going to want to resolve in the same direction, and they'll create parallel octaves. Instead, what we typically see is that the third of the chord is doubled. And if we were to go back and voice lead that Mozart in four voices, we'd see that would be the smoothest way to do it. We can sometimes double the fifth, but that third is a bit more preferable, particularly because it follows how the Neapolitan would have evolved. If we think in A minor for a second, and we think of that D minor chord that would have preceded the Neapolitan in the Mozart example, if we think of it in four voices, it would make sense to double the root of that four chord. Well, the root of that four chord is D, and that D is the third of the Neapolitan. So it actually makes good voice leading sense to double that third in the Neapolitan, though there may be some other aspects. Of particular interest is how to deal with that flat 2. So there are two ways that are primarily used to voice lead that flat 2. We have the mode of going flat 2 to 1 to sharp 7. So we move from the lowered second scale degree, it's voice led to scale degree 1, then to scale degree 7. And that's what we heard in the Mozart example. Or we could move directly from flat 2 to sharp 7 if we were going directly to a 5 chord. And that's also acceptable. Remember that in this style, even though this looks weird, that's just forming the interval of a diminished third. And in the common practice era, moving by diminished intervals is absolutely okay. It's when we move by augmented intervals that things get a little tricky, and those occur more rarely. So moving by diminished third is absolutely fine, and even though it looks strange, it's absolutely okay to move from flat 2 to sharp 7. In fact, we see Beethoven doing that in the first movement of his Moonlight Sonata. So if we conceptualize the opening as a four-voice texture, with a bass voice, a tenor voice, an alto voice, and a soprano voice, we can see that he follows this voice leading procedure. And we can follow, quote-unquote, the alto voice and see this second type of idiomatic resolution of the Neapolitan. So if you follow my mouse pointer and you look at this dotted box right here, we see the appearance of the Neapolitan. Let me play up until that moment. So here we have the Neapolitan chord, and we envision this middle note of the triplet as the alto voice. We can see the C sharp moves up to the D natural. And where does that D natural move? Well, it moves down to that sharp 7, that B sharp right there. So there's our diminished third leap if we conceptualize this as a four-voice texture, moving from D natural down to B sharp, from flat 2 down to sharp 7. You'll also notice that Beethoven does double the third of this chord. So if we imagine D natural as quote-unquote the root of the Neapolitan, then we'll see that we have this voice down here in F sharp. Yes, it's doubled in octaves down below, but we'll reduce it down to just this F sharp. And we see up above in the soprano voice, we have this F sharp up here as well. So we have two thirds there. And everything works out just fine because there's no issues of tendency tones. The tendency tone of the flat 2 resolves down to the sharp 7. And in this case, he ends up moving by contrary motion in the outer voices. The F sharp moves up to the G sharp, and this upper F sharp holds over before resolving downwards, and everything works very smoothly. As we move towards the Neapolitan, listen for the moment we arrive and how much like a beam of light it is. It's a very special moment. It's a very dramatic moment, and it's often reserved for expressive music throughout the common practice era. It's a striking harmony that composers love using, and particularly for dramatic effect.